Welcome back, everyone, in the third session of Resistance School. Woo! We at Resistance School are committed to equipping you with leadership and organizing skills taught by leading academics and practitioners so you can go forth to rebuild, reclaim, and reimagine America. In this session, Jesse Ulibarri will lead us on how to develop a theory of change. By the end of tonight, you will learn how to draft a theory of change for your group by determining goals, assessing possible solutions, and identifying targets through power mapping. All essential skills for leading your communities. And now an intro to our speaker, Jesse Ulibarri. Jesse Ulibarri is currently the interim co-executive director of Wellstone Action, the nation's largest training and capacity building organization for the progressive movement. He has trained thousands of community organizers, campaign managers, and community organizers and elected officials to build a democracy where everyone is in, no one is out, no exception. In addition to his role at Wellstone Action, Jesse currently served on the Colorado State Senate, representing his home district north of Denver, Colorado. Before joining Wellstone, Jesse spent a decade leading community organizing and public policy efforts throughout the country. He served as the public policy director at the ACLU of Colorado, state director at Mi Familia Vota, the Economic Justice Campaign Director at Colorado Progressive Coalition, and as a congressional staffer for Congressman Luis Gutierrez. Jesse now resides in a small suburb outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with his husband and 2 kids. Whether you want to grow an organization, empower the members of your community to take action, or hone your own leadership development skills, this training will help you magnify your impact and grow the progressive movement. Please join me in welcoming Jesse.
Wow, thank you. And thank you, CU and the team here with Resistance School. It's a joy to be here. And before I get started, I want to thank the people who made it possible. I want to thank Elizabeth Patton and Phil Burkaw, who helped me with the content this evening, making sure that it fits within the timeframes that we have, the amazing work that they did to get me here on time and looking fresh and young and wonderful for you all. And I also want to thank my team at Wellstone Action, Kaisa Dennis and Christy Pascal, who also helped with content. And then Jason Maragasa and his crew at VNEC Media for filming the session, all your work to make this accessible to everyone online. And I also want to thank the rest of the Resistance School team that I've had the opportunity to work with this evening. Y'all are phenomenal folks that are helping to democratize the knowledge about how to change the world. So thank you for all that you do. So folks, I get to talk to you about something pretty amazing. How to change the world. All right? That's why you're here. That's what Resistance School is all about. And I come at this with a little bit of my own expertise and experience. I'm going to talk to you about building power to win on our issues, but I know Marshall would get mad at me if I didn't start with my story of self, my story of us, story of now. So that's where I'm going to begin, something you learned in session 1. So what was shared in my bio is true. I had the great honor of representing my home district in the state senate in Colorado, and that district is just north of Denver. It's a place that has an oil refinery, a coal-fired power plant, 5 landfills, and the wastewater treatment plant. And I grew up right in the middle. You know that saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. I am trailer treasure. I was that kid with the ducktail and a chihuahua named Tina Turner in the 80s. That was me. And I grew up in a community that showed me love, but also that was daily living the impacts of poor public policy, bad health impacts, lack of access to good jobs and good opportunities. And not surprisingly, I was one of the few who made it out of that community to become the first person in my family to get a 4-year degree and go into college. So for me, coming into this work was actually a living manifestation of the daily realities of what was happening in my community. And so I went First person in my family to get a 4-year degree. I go into college my first year, and the state legislature decided to double tuition at our public universities to balance the budget. I was paying my way. And I started meeting other students who were in a similar situation who said, this seems unfair, this seems unjust. Someone should do something about it. And looked around, absent-minded. Someone should do something about it. Looked around, absent-minded. Someone should do something about it. And then we kind of looked at each other and said, I think that's us. And so we went to the state capitol when I was 18 and lobbied against the doubling of tuition at our public universities and won. In my first year, as an 18-year-old, kept my tuition the way it was, and I got to stay in college and keep the hopes and dreams of my family and my community still on my shoulders, and persisted. So by the time I was 19, I was the designated lobbyist for our student government down in the Capitol every single day, fighting for access to higher education for low-income students, for students of color, for immigrants and refugees. That changed my life. It showed me that we have power when we show up and we use our voice, and when we know where power resides. And so that's what I get to talk to you about. It feels a little funny to be here on Harvard's campus. I'm going to be challenging one of its most famous alumni, Elle Woods. Like it's hard or something, right? Changing the world, like it's hard or something? It's not hard to change the world. In fact, it is one of the easiest things to do when we know what we're doing. So tonight, we're going to be talking about a theory of change, and that's specifically how do you go about enacting the community change that you seek. And this is pretty simple and straightforward, but we actually have to start with a hypothesis about the kind of change we seek, and we have to figure out how to make that happen. How do we take our most radical imagination, the thing that we want the world to be, how do we turn that into reality? And I say that as a kid from a trailer park who just 2 weeks ago was on stage with Senator Elizabeth Warren, your senator here in Massachusetts, talking about the future of the Democratic Party. And the night before that, I had dinner with Vice President Mondale. Our most radical dreams can become realities. Changing power in our communities can become reality if we do the hard work. When I was elected to the state Senate, side by side with a group of progressive colleagues and people who had been organizing in our communities for years, everything that we had been fighting for over a decade became law. The first time I did a grassroots policy visit and actually testified in committee in our state legislature, it was on the In-State DREAM Act. So undocumented students who had resided in Colorado couldn't go to our public universities and not be treated as international students. I testified, I was so excited, I was 19 at the time, and I wanted to see this bill pass. I was a citizen. I testified without consequence. All of the undocumented folks who testified on that bill were reported to Immigration and Customs Enforcement in that hearing by the committee chairman. I saw that happen, and it pissed me off. And my community said, this is not the way our democracy should work, we should change things. So every single year, we fought on this bill to get access to higher education for undocumented students. And the year I was elected to the Colorado State Senate, I got to chair the full Senate as we passed that into law. You might not know this, a lot of people don't know the history of what happened in Colorado due to our deep organizing efforts and progressive work. But that year, my first year in the state legislature, we passed in-state tuition for undocumented residents, driver's licenses for undocumented residents, the state earned income tax credit, the Colorado child tax credit, the largest renewable energy standard in the country. We passed civil unions, comprehensive gun background checks, and a whole other host of gun safety measures. We also expanded labor protections and making sure that folks weren't discriminated at work and access to free birth control. Also, marijuana became legal. Usually people end on that note, or they hear that in the news. We also closed 6 prisons, 4 of them private, and started to tackle mass incarceration. We did that in less than 120 days, my first year in the legislature. It's not hard. It is not hard. I'm 34 years old. I stand here as a testament to say it is not hard, but it does take work. You have to focus your energies, and you have to figure out what is the change that I seek? What is the world that I want to live in? And then how do I get there? So the theory of change actually talks and starts from that place of vision, of radical imagination, of saying, this is the world we deserve to live in. I deserve to drive a Volvo and wear a Patagonia jacket, drive around with my husband, and be legally married. That's the one I wanted, not to be poisoned in the water by the refinery that I live next to, right? But you also have to understand who has the power to bring about the change and who or what influences them. So we're going to actually talk about power mapping as well. That's part B of a theory of change. And part C is, what are the actions our group need to take to activate this, and then move these things and put these steps into motion? And so a theory of change is really simply summarized as, if we do C, then A will happen because of B. So if we go and talk to our legislators about healthcare reform, then we'll have access to healthcare reform because we organized. Make sense? So I'm going to ask a question of you all now, and just with a show of hands, I want you to raise your hands if you believe that your current reality matches all of your wildest dreams. Okay, no one. So I'm going to ask a question, and we're going to do some mic runners now. What would your current reality, how would your current reality be different if you were living your fullest dreams? Not just for you, but for the community in which you live. How would things be different? Describe it to me. About any issue you care about, any part of your community. We have some in here. Let's wait for the microphone so folks online can hear us.
I would know when I was safe.
You would know when you were safe. Yeah. So what would have to change for that to happen?
Recognition, not just by me, but by others, that I was not safe.
Thank you for sharing that. So recognition that you're not safe, and support from others in your community to build up your safety. How about for others? How would your daily reality look different if we were living our dreams? If the policies, the structures, the institutions that shape our daily lives were different, how would it look?
We wouldn't be seeing homeless people on the streets here every day.
What would we see instead of seeing homeless people on the street here in Cambridge?
We'd see no one on the street.
Say that again?
We'd see no one on the street.
Where would they be?
In homes, in beds, in shelters, somewhere.
Yeah. So instead of seeing folks sleep on the street, we would see them cared for by their community. They would have roofs over their heads, meals in their stomachs.
Yeah.
It's a great example. Others? One here, and then we'll move on.
I think it will look different when I and the other citizens have a voice to raise, and that voice is heard by the government, and we can make a difference in the country.
I promise he wasn't a plant, but this is where I'm going with this. Thank you very much for saying that. Where we have an equal voice and an equal say in our democracy. What's the gap between our reality and our dreams right now? What bridges the gap between our reality and our dreams? You don't have to answer necessarily, someone else can. I'm going to make a bold statement here. This gap, what fills this gap is power. If we want to turn our current reality into our dream reality, if we want to actually see these things enacted into policy or into daily practice of having people get off the streets and into shelters and protected by their community, or making sure our neighbors are safe, or making sure that our democracy is well protected, we need power. And that's hard to say at a space like this when we're talking about resistance and fighting the power, because mostly we see or experience power in a negative way. For those of us who come from marginalized communities who have had power exercised against us, it comes with a lot of baggage. As a person of color, as a queer person, as someone who grew up low income, power usually meant the forces, the systems, the institutions that were doing harm to me. But I want us to get out of that mindset, especially tonight. Because if we think that politics is about the improvement of people's lives, I'm going to say that again, that is at the core of who we are at Wellstone Action, the organization I work for, the content that you have here tonight. We think that politics should be about the improvement of people's lives. And if we are not living our dreams, that means we do not have the power yet to live those dreams. So part of our work as organizers, as resistors, as people who want to see and build a better America, then what we have to do is actually fight for power. So are there any folks in this room who speak Spanish? Raise of hands. Okay, a couple. So poder, if you could tell us in a microphone what poder means, the translation. Alexis, can you come down? Someone raise their hand over here. Yeah. Means power. What else does it mean? It's a verb.
Something. To be able to do something.
Yes. So the two definitions are power, or the ability to do, the ability to achieve. And that's the definition that we're going to be using today, which if we are seeking power, it is the ability to do something, the ability to achieve our most wildest dreams, right? It sounds simple, and it is, and it's meant to be simple. If we can envision it and build together, if we can build those relationships that you learned about in session 2, if you can share your story like you learned in session 1, and if you can use the tactics that you learned in session 4, that's the teaser to come back, right? Then you can change the world, fundamentally. That's the only way we do it. So I have the great pleasure of working for an organization called Wellstone Action. We're the nation's largest training and technical assistance organization helping to support grassroots organizers, campaign managers, candidates, and elected officials who want to improve people's lives. And so every day I get to go out and have conversations with folks just like you, a group of wonderful weirdos who sit in dark classrooms with no windows talking about changing the world. Most people don't wake up every day and say, oh, the world needs me. You all did. Thank you. And I'm being very serious about that. Thank you, thank you, thank you for waking up every single day and believing that the world needs you, because we do, every single one of us. But the work that we do is based in our own theory of change, which is the idea that community organizing, the essence of what you learned in session 2, the building of relationships for purpose, strategic public relationships, is incredibly important in social change work. It is the basis. But relationship for relationship's sake doesn't move the ball forward. We can have a lot of great and impactful relationships in our communities, but if it has no vision, if it doesn't have an ability to execute power, then those relationships are important, but they cannot significantly change our daily lives. Community organizing has to be connected to a broader ecosystem. And in that, we actually have to get our hands dirty. We have to be in the fray. And that we have to choose our decision makers. Oftentimes, we as folks who care about changing the world spend so much time in community organizing without saying, I'm often talking to policymakers who have no idea what the world is like for me or my community. And I'm trying to get them to understand or be empathetic, and they just don't get it. Well, there's another option for us. We can actually change the choices of who's in elected office. We can change who serves in city council or school board or as our members of Congress or even our president. And that's electoral politics. It's actually engaging with voters at the ballot box. So our decision makers actually reflect us, that we have a reflective democracy that actually speaks to our core issues, interests, and values. And finally, if we just did community organizing and we built really good intentional public relationships and we did really good organizing work that led to electoral mobilizing, we got people out to the polls, but had no vision, right? We'd be floundering as a nation, as a movement. So public policy, electoral politics, and community organizing must be central, and they are co-equally important in community change work. If we're not working at all three cross-purposes at the same time, we lose. If we just do community organizing, we lose. If we just have brilliant public policy ideas that get put into binders, they're going to sit on a shelf and collect dust. And if we just ran egotistical, self-serving politicians without community organizing to hold those folks accountable, we'll still lose. But these three parts are co-equally important to how we change the world. And I'm going to talk about their interplay and their connection as we go through using a framework that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But for us as an organization, Wellstone is deeply committed to building up the leadership of everyday people, people like you in this room, who want to change the world and maybe don't know how. There are some simple tools that we use that you can use on a chalkboard or on a piece of paper. You don't need a fancy PowerPoint. And for those of you at home, you're actually going to be able to do this at your computer. So we encourage you to use these tools because this is how change happens. So when we start talking about this, it's actually about turning our intentions into reality. And we start with a plan. So again, I'm going to ask a question, if we can have mic runners come down. Why do we plan when we start to work on issue campaigns to change the world? Why do we plan? What are some of the reasons? Hands again?
Well, without a plan, we don't know who do you talk to. We don't know what's going to be the best tactics to go and reach people or communicate what the issue is to the common person and maybe get some ground support going, or also to make sure that we're speaking to the right people. You know, if you don't have a plan, it's never going to go, and you're never going to get success. You have to go and figure out where that point is.
Yeah, it identifies key stakeholders. Who are we going to talk to, and what are we going to do? Let's get some more hands up. What else does a plan help us do? I see a hand back there, right here. Yeah.
Opportunity favors the prepared, so I imagine having a plan make sure you're ready for success.
Yeah, having a plan increases your likelihood of success, and you know where you're going. Other reasons to plan. There's a person here. And please remember to say your name before you speak and then share your comment.
Sure. My name is Ricky Carter. One of the advantages of a plan is that people don't end up going off in a bunch of different directions on their own, so you have a kind of focus.
Yeah. The work that you're about to engage in or embark upon is incredibly important, and you don't want to diffuse your energy. You want to make sure that it's focused in the way you want, right? That's what I just heard you say. Provides focus and direction so people know exactly where they're going. It also uses resources and people efficiently. That was what this gentleman over here said. Share your name again. Keith Bernard. Great. But it also establishes benchmarks. It helps us to figure out, are we going in the direction that we want to? If we want to eliminate homelessness in our community, like was shared earlier, are we actually seeing people off the streets and in shelter, or are they just leaving our communities because it's become hostile, right? It helps us to evaluate our work. And it lets you know if you're winning, which is important when we actually want to change the world for the better. We want to improve people's lives. It is life or death sometimes. Getting someone off the street during winter can be a life or death issue. So when we talk about winning, it is not just about a sportsman-like competition. It is actually matters of life and death that you deal with when you want to change the world. And finally, we put plans together, and we do this work in the theory of change to make sure that we're democratizing knowledge, that as we are out talking to our neighbors, our friends, people in our organizations, they understand not just the tactic that we're engaged in. We're doing a flash mob. Great, this is what we're going to do. And in a step, doot, 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 right? It's good that they know that, but why? Why are we doing it at U.S. Senator Cory Gardner's office, and why are we doing it at noon on the day that this vote is being held? That we're actually helping people to understand beyond just the tactics what needs to happen to change the world. So we heard a little bit of this earlier, but a strategic plan answers these key questions. Who will do what to whom, when, and for how much? And this is essential as we start to put together our theory of change connected to issue campaigns. So who assigns who is responsible for doing the work, the actual implementation day in and day out, and the what defines the most effective activities and actions to demonstrate and leverage our power. So we're not just choosing tactics because they sound fun or kitschy or that they would be really cool to put on Facebook, but they are actually about leveraging our power. They are strategic choices connected to changing the world for the better. And then whom actually is the key decision makers that we're trying to influence and that we're actually trying to get our targets to do something. I'll talk about these terms in just a second. When is just the campaign timeline with each action and activity. And then how much? What are the resources we're expending? That's time, people, or money. How are we expending it? And then how much of that will it take? Do we need 200 volunteers to occupy an office? Do we need 1,000 voters to turn out in this election? Do we need lots of money to put ads on TV about how terrible this health repeal vote will be? We actually have to start putting numbers to paper if we want to figure out how to make this work. So when we talk about building grassroots power to affect change or how we begin to build a movement, there's the interplay between advocacy, grassroots organizing, and electoral work. I talked a little bit about this, but I want you all to understand the difference between organizing and mobilizing. Organizing is the deep relationships that we build for purpose, for strategic purpose. And so that's at the core of grassroots organizing. Mobilizing work is getting those relationships to do the things that we need to affect the change we want. So that's actually mobilizing. You've built those relationships. Now you're going back to those people who care about those same issues, interests, and values that you care about to go and lobby their state legislators or their city councilors or their members of Congress. It's actually building up coalitions to maybe move a ballot measure. Or it's saying, hey, this is all for naught. Let's actually change the picture and decide who should be in office differently in the electoral work. So today we're going to be talking about a framework that we use at Wellstone Action called VAST, Vision, Assessment, Strategy, and Tactics. And today we're only going to be focusing on the first two letters, vision and assessment. The first is to help define our goal, and then the second is to go through a power analysis and targeting process that will inform your strategy and tactics. So again, I'm going to ask for a show of hands. Who here got involved in community change work through a really fun and exciting tactic? Raise your hand and we'll get mics. Anyone ever been to a protest or a rally? Okay. For many, our first entry into organizing and community change work is through tactics. hey, there's this really exciting speaker who's coming to campus. Will you join me? I want you to learn about this person. And we go, and then they say, let's go storm the steps of the Capitol in the dead of night when no one's there. It's not specific or targeted. But we spend a lot of time actually focusing on tactics in our movement without understanding the pieces that come before and the decisions, the strategic decisions that have come before that actually root us in our vision, have been based in an assessment and understanding of power, so our tactics actually do the thing that we want. So this gets back to that theory of change. So when we talked about if we want this to happen, this must happen for this to happen, right? So with vision, assessment, and strategy, we're going to spend some time actually stepping back from, oh, I just participated in a tactic because it sounded fun, or I think we should do this action against a state legislator, even though they're completely with us, or maybe I want to do a protest, and back up and say, let's actually figure out what our vision is of the world, how do we assess it, and then how do we move power. Strategy and tactics will be covered in session 4, so know that that's coming later. That's not to say that it's not important, but we have dedicated an entire section of time for that as well. So when we start talking about setting a vision statement, we actually have to start with the problem that we're faced with, whether it's homelessness or it's an immigration regime that really separates families and causes folks to be deported based in racism and xenophobia. We have to actually understand the larger problem that we want to change. And if we're not starting there, it makes everything else more difficult. Because when we start thinking about vision, assessment, strategy, and tactics, we have to know what we're dealing with, because all of our other decisions are born from that understanding. So if we want to take on a terrible immigration regime and the separation of families and deportation, we're probably not going to start by saying what needs to change is school board policy. Right? The federal government controls immigration policy, and there needs to be a lot of work that's done at the federal level. But guess what? If we can't move anything at the federal level, this is why we actually start with the assessment, maybe we can do something to protect kids at schools, and we'll go to the school board level. But we have to understand the context and the full view of the problem. That starts to inform a list of potential solutions. One of our bad habits as a progressive movement is to actually just believe there is one solution. And I mentioned that a little bit in the immigration example. Oh, the only thing we can do is comprehensive immigration reform. And so let's put all of our energy into this thing that is not currently passing, and we've done multiple assessments. It's not likely to pass at the federal level, but let's just put all of our energy there. Well, what that might mean then is that we're stuck with only one potential solution, and there are a lot of other things that people can do. For example, state legislatures and municipal bodies have started passing municipal ID programs or driver's license programs, so when law enforcement stops undocumented folks, they don't get separated from their families, they get a speeding ticket, right? That's a workaround, right? If family separation is the problem and a bad immigration system is the key, and something like a big dragnet of law enforcement is one of the challenges, we don't have to just fix federal law. We can make changes at the state or local level as well. Right? But if we don't think that there are other solutions, we're just going after one over and over again. I'll give another example. When I was headed into the state legislature, a bill had been run almost 10 years in a row, and it was to set up a state wage theft law. And this is incredibly important. Many low-wage workers have their wages withheld by their employers and never get paid for work that they've completed. We used to call that slavery, economic indentured servitude. You know, it is actually illegal. And if you're an employee and you steal out of the cash register, that is called theft. But if your employer takes your paycheck, that's not called theft. It's not punishable with jail time. There's not comparable penalties. And so every single year we ran this one bill that was, let's put criminal penalties on wage theft. So if an employer steals an employee's paycheck, put that person in prison. And it didn't pass. And it didn't pass. And it didn't pass. And then I came in the year that we had a Democratic majority, and it didn't pass. And I was like, we built the power. Our communities were organizing it. It was the right policy. It was the right policy. And in fact, it was the wrong policy. Because what it would have done is put employers in jail. But the workers who had been pushing this forever just wanted to pay their rent. They wanted their money back. They wanted a system of enforcement that made sure that they got paid for the work that they had done. Putting their employer in prison actually didn't do that, right? But we had our minds set on one single policy solution. The next year, when we introduced an administrative enforcement of wage and hour laws that actually investigated and was on the side of workers, that passed. And today, millions of dollars have gotten back into the pockets of workers who earned those wages, right? But because we were focused on one potential solution, we kept losing, and workers lost millions of dollars in the meantime. So part of our challenge is we actually have to think about a bunch of different solutions, and then we have to come back to our assessment and say, does this make sense based on all of the goal criteria we set? Does this make sense? And then we move forward. So when I said vision, you have to clearly define the problem, brainstorm solutions, and then evaluate solutions against goal criteria. But one of the most challenging parts about this is figuring out, is this an issue of relationships? If I'm trying to pass a certain local ordinance on my council, is it just that my council doesn't know anything about this issue and they need education? And maybe I need to build a relationship with them as someone who is a healthcare advocate or someone with a disability who needs access to medical services in our community. Is this just an issue of relationships? And that if I build that relationship, boom, overnight that thing would pass into law or my life would be different. Part of that is we have to figure out, is it about building deeper relationships between communities or within our own community? The other question is this a policy issue? So if the change we're seeking isn't just about deeper, more meaningful relationships that can change hearts and minds, maybe there are structural things that need our attention. Maybe there are specific policies that can improve our lives that we need to move forward. And if we need to change the law, where do we generate policy ideas and at what level do we want to engage in? This is one of the more challenging things because our democracy, the way it works is we can engage at the very local level or at the very national level, and it's about doing an assessment of power and figuring out who has the ability tomorrow to affect the change that we seek. Maybe not tomorrow, but in the general sense, who has the ability to affect the change we seek? And then if we go through that, if we realize it's not an issue of relationships and maybe it is a policy issue that needs to advance, but we can't advance it in the places where we want to, do we need to change the relationships of power? Do we need to actually change who are the deciders and replace those folks? That's also a strategy. This gets back to the interplay of the Wellstone Triangle of electoral politics, community organizing, and public policy. All of these options are available to us all of the time. And it is up to us to assess those very specific dynamics to change the issue landscape, to change the lived realities for people in our communities. So let me give you an example, and then we're going to actually have some folks locally model their own thinking in this in an issue campaign. So in 2009, there was a group of folks who were working to organize domestic workers in the state of New York. And domestic workers are folks who work in households, maybe as household staff, as caretakers, as house cleaners, and they are highly subjected to abuse. Lack of pay, overtime violations, threats of violence or intimidation, immigration intimidation, holding of documents and paperwork. And the domestic workers who had been organizing for a long time said, we need to change our reality. In fact, they said our problem statement was they're not protected by many laws and are vulnerable to exploitation and abuse largely because they're hidden in the home. And so the folks started coming together and saying, let's change this. We don't have to be subjected to exploitation and abuse. We can change our reality if we organize. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance said, let's figure out what some solutions could be. One of the solutions was we could run individual grievance campaigns against the most egregious individual employers. And so when there was a bad actor, we could go and protest outside of that person's home or make sure that that person paid back wages or overtime, but that's very worker specific. Number two was you could set up a fund for workers who have had their wages stolen to make sure that those folks get the money back, but that would not necessarily come from the employers themselves. The third was develop a public education campaign about the issue of domestic worker abuse. And the fourth was start a domestic worker counseling center and support group. And the fifth was pass a domestic workers' bill of rights to provide overtime pay, protection from discrimination, notice of termination, and other basic benefits. So instead of just jumping to one solution, like let's just run grievance campaigns, or let's just do public education, or let's pass a bill, they said there are a lot of potential solutions to meet the needs of our membership. So let's actually think about those and then assess them against goal criteria. So this is a tool that you all can use as well, and it's something that we're going to practice in just a few moments. But some of the criteria, additional criteria you could use is results in measurable reductions in racial gender disparities, consistent with our values and vision, unifying, doesn't divide our potential allies. But here are the goal criteria they used. They took their possible solutions and then mapped those out across these key items. will it actually improve people's lives? Pretty basic set measurement. The next was, is it specific and measurable? Can we actually know we've achieved this thing? The third was, is it winnable? Can we actually do this? And along what timeline would it be winnable? Is this a 20-year campaign to get to egregious actors, or is it a 5-year campaign or a 2-year campaign? And will it change power relationships? Meaning, will our workers have changed the dynamic where they have the ability to improve their lives? Also, will it build our organization? And sometimes people will balk at this one, and I just want to note, we say this, will it build our organization? Because when we build power, more power should be the outcome. If politics is about the improvement of people's lives, then as we build organization, more people, more volunteers, advocating for a more just world, that's a good thing. So does this build our organization, our allies, our money, our volunteer base? Great. And ultimately, does this excite us? So they use this goal criteria to try and map out across which solution they would choose. So here are the 5 solutions we talked about before. And let's think about improving people's lives. Grievance campaigns, setting up a fund for workers who had their wages stolen, public ed campaign, domestic worker counseling center, and domestic worker bill of rights. When they did this and went through improving people's lives, all but number 3 really would have direct, immediate impacts on people's lives, but you have to think about scale. For an individual grievance campaign, that's going after one individual employer, that might help one person. It will improve their lives, but it doesn't change structurally other people's lives. A public education campaign will be good and could maybe change the dynamics, but immediately doesn't improve people's lives. So as they were going through these solutions, they had to ask really tough questions. The second, is it specific and measurable? If you ran a grievance campaign, could you actually measure how much money was generated back to individuals? Yes. Same thing if there was a public fund to restore stolen wages. Yes. One that was not sure was the domestic worker bill of rights. Big question mark. Could we actually track how it improved people's lives? Winnable. They decided, when they did this criteria, that a grievance campaign actually wasn't winnable because there would be so many individual actors where there would have to be so many individual grievance campaigns that in fact it would never be winnable. It wouldn't structurally change the relationships. And so it would be responsive every single time. So they said, nope, that one doesn't actually meet the bar of winnable in this time frame because it's a never-ending feat. But same thing, there was a big question mark about the domestic bill of rights. Altering power relationships, you could see a lot of these actually didn't structurally change how workers were relating to their employers or the conditions in which they were advocating for their own agency. And here in building our orgs and exciting us, there were a lot of question marks and open work. In looking at this, where do you think that the National Domestic Workers Alliance decided to focus their energy? Which number? You can show on your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see 5. I see 2. Yeah, ultimately they decided to go with number 5. But they had a lot of options. And they did the thorough process of understanding what their problem was, the context of their problem, and then they chose a path forward. And they said, where we're going to go next is to pass a domestic bill of rights, and that means we're going to do some work in the legislature. And ultimately, that bill did pass into law, and that's part of another story. So now I'm going to invite 2 folks locally who've come tonight, Sean Edwards and Michelle Olson from Indivisible Somerville and Minutemen Indivisible, to talk about some of the work they did to set their vision and determine their organizing goal in recent campaigns. So please help me welcome Michelle and Sean. We're going to get them mic'd up. So if you could do just a quick introduction of who you are and the groups you're with and your most recent campaign that you took on.
Sure. So my name is Sean Edwards. I'm an organizer for Indivisible Somerville, and I really wanted to talk about the Affordable Care Act and the back and forth that's been happening and continues to happen over that issue.
Great. Thank you.
I'm Michelle Olson with Minutemen Indivisible out in Lexington. We've been working on lots of issues, but the healthcare has certainly been top of the agenda over the course of the last few months.
Great. So back us up a little bit. Everyone has heard healthcare debate in the public media, But how did you come to that as a problem, individually and then as organizations? How did you come to that problem, and talk us through some of your process?
So I think for our organization, for Indivisible Somerville, we believe that that people should have health care, and we viewed this fight as essentially the effort to take people's health care away, and so that that I think was a fight worth fighting for.
Okay. How about for you?
Yeah, when Indivisible formed at the beginning of January, right after the election, many of our members came with healthcare at the top of the agenda for them personally. They felt a personal threat to their healthcare, and many of our members felt that healthcare was a fundamental human right, and that universal access to safe, affordable care was on the top of their priority list for a healthy society.
Great. So what I want to reflect back is you both said something big, which was you were setting a big vision. Universal healthcare is a human right, and your organizations wanted to spend time advancing that cause. But, dun dun dun, there was a problem, right? That's the context in which we actually establish our campaigns. Can you tell me what the problem was? Why was there healthcare at risk?
Sure. Well, back in 2010, there was the Affordable Health Care Act passed, and that established health care for a large segment of the population. And with the incoming new administration as well as Congress, there was talk of repealing the Affordable Care Act, which would have put under threat health care to roughly 20 to 24 million Americans and made it much less affordable for many more than that.
Yeah. So there was an imminent threat. At what level of government?
The federal level.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it would impact healthcare for millions of people.
Millions.
Yep. You heard all of this in the news. So what did you choose to do? What was the solution you offered?
So, at first, what we chose to do was to ask our representatives to oppose the bill, and being in Massachusetts, they said, well, of course. And so we went to them and said, no, but really, please. And they said, yeah, we're working on it. And so, at that point, we were kind of like, okay, well, what do we do now? If our representatives are actually on our side on this issue, and showing up in their offices is actually just taking their staff's time when they could be fighting for this issue, what do we do from there?
Yeah. So what did you decide to do? Where did you decide to focus your efforts?
Well, after 17 thank you notes to Elizabeth Warren and a few posters and rallies, we moved on and said, well, who are the decision makers? Who really holds the decision to this? It's not Elizabeth Warren or Catherine Clark, our congressperson, but it's those who are sitting on the fence. So we said, well, how can we get to them?
Yeah. And you're going to hear in a little bit who those people were and what activities these folks engaged in. But let's actually map out what we heard. They said universal health care is a right for all people, and that's currently under attack. Not that everyone had access to health care, but there was a big piece of legislation that passed that expanded health care to millions. And that was at risk of being overturned by the current administration, right? Problem, context. Solution is let's keep the health care that we got and then we can build some more, right? And so they took on the congressional health care fight. What were some other potential solutions you considered to try and increase access to universal health care as a universal right for everyone? What were the other potential solutions that your organizations talked about?
So we talked about expanding Medicare for all. We talked about different I guess policy initiatives that I think would have been a substitute for the ACA that I think that my group at least would have been open to supporting. In terms of defending the ACA, we talked about social media campaigns and advocating to people in the districts of the people that we wanted to persuade. I think that stood out pretty quickly to us as a vector that we wanted to pursue of let's find the people who are actually represented by the people we want to persuade and connect with them.
Great. Michelle?
Yeah, well, we also thought, well, we all know that the ACA has issues. It's by no means a perfect system. And many people in our group were firm advocates of a single-payer solution. And so they were concerned with, how can we promote that? And Massachusetts being probably more open to that kind of a solution in their state legislatures. Many people pursued going to the State House here in Massachusetts to promote a single-payer policy here in Massachusetts that could serve as a model that would work in other states.
Great. So you can hear in their organizing work, they knew that there was an immediate and urgent work in front of them, which was to stop the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And ultimately, that was the solution that they chose, because when they looked at their goal criteria, it would help them build their membership. It would actually respond to the crisis in front of them. It would change the power dynamics by stopping something when even in Republican control, people could stop this bill from passing because of the lived impacts and lived realities. But at the same time, they had other solutions that would get to the ultimate goal of a country that actually cares for its people and has a health care system that works, right? And so state legislative action to actually build a model here in Massachusetts that could be seen across the country as the way it should be done was a potential solution. Another was engaging directly in other states to learn organizing tools and methods to make sure that they could win in the long term. Right? Those were other potential solutions that were offered. So we go through this to show this process. To set your vision, you have to understand the problem and context, and then you have to assess your potential solutions against goal criteria. The next part, though, is after you come to a potential solution, especially if it's a legislative one, you need to understand where the policyholders, the policymakers, the decision makers are in relationship to the issue you've set as your goal. So you want to actually understand how much power do they have to enact the solution that you think is the best and right one, and how supportive they are of your point of view. This is challenging because it's using dynamic information, the level of power related to an issue. And that is, again, I'm going to say the level of power related to a specific issue, not just their general level of power. Oftentimes, we assume people who have a very high title have lots of power, and that might not be true when it comes to a specific issue. My background and expertise is in racial justice, economic justice. I am not a doctor. I don't know much about health policy, and so when there were healthcare decisions being made in the state legislature about healthcare policy, I turned to our local resident doctor who was in the legislature with me to help me understand. In those scenarios, she was the chairwoman of the health committee. She had a lot of institutional power because of her position, but because of her role as a doctor outside of the legislature, she became eminently more powerful around healthcare decisions. She could actually tell us how insurance companies worked and where the loopholes were and what we could do to fix the insurance industry in Colorado. And that gave her a lot of power. So power isn't just about title, it's about the ability to achieve, the ability to move something forward. Having a doctor in the Senate allowed us to significantly move healthcare policy because she knew the ins and outs, and that gave her more power in the context of the legislature. When we talk about a power map, we're assessing both the level of support and the power that they have. So on a power map, and I'm going to show you one in just a few minutes, you actually put a few different folks. You put decision makers. And these are the people or groups who can actually make the decisions to change or resolve the problem, not the people who can influence the process. These are the people who are sitting on the dais in a city council or sitting in a state house or state senate chamber or members of Congress who will push that button, who will vote yes or no, will say yay or nay, and actually will change the outcome. So you have to understand the problem, you have to understand the context, and then you have to understand where you're trying to influence the change to understand who the decision makers are. If you are trying to pass a municipal ordinance and you go to your state senator, that's probably a bad choice, because if you're trying to change city policy, a state senator doesn't sit on city council. They have no influence on what happens on city council. They may have a relationship with someone on city council, but they're not the person making the vote, right? So when we think about decision makers, it's the people who will be voting yes or no. We also put on power maps organized allies. And these are people who are organized in support of our agenda, who share our worldview. And there are some keywords in here. Organized. Organized groups is the key word. This isn't just my friend Bob or my friend Sally who thinks I have a good idea, but it is actually maybe Resistance School and the alumni of Resistance School who thinks this is a good idea and are willing to put their time, energy, and resources into changing this. And they have relationships with those city councilors, and they're willing to exercise their influence over those city councilors to change their opinion. Right? It is about organized and groups of people, not just individuals. And then you also put on organized opposition. These are people who are not just opposed, generally, tacitly, but they are actively investing their resources against you. They hold an opposing view, and they are the folks who are trying to kill your piece of legislation. They're the folks who are actually trying to undermine your campaign because they have a different set of values and beliefs. And so in the case we heard earlier, it was their organized opponents were the people who were pushing the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, the individual organizations that were actually fighting for the repeal of the ACA. You would put them on a power map as well. In zeroing in and defining our targets, primary targets are the people who can actually make the decisions or change the problem. They can resolve the problem. And we're going to talk about primary targets because we already have decision makers on there. We have organized allies, organized oppositions. But primary targets are the people that you need to focus your energy into to actually resolve the problem. This may be a handful of people in a congressional body or on a specific committee or in a city council who will be the deciding votes. They are the influential folks you need to convince to ultimately move your agenda. Secondary targets are people who have influence over decision makers, people who may have the ability to change a person's opinion or belief. And so that's not the person who's taking the vote, but it may be the priest or the minister who's giving a sermon from the pulpit and the city council person sitting in the front row, right? And they can inform their worldview. Secondary targets can be incredibly helpful to move our agenda, but they're not the people who make the ultimate decision at the end of the day. So that will get to our conversation in just a minute. A power map maps two things out. There are two different axes. 1 to 10 on the left side of the screen is the amount of power that this person holds within the context of this issue. Again, it's not for every single decision in a legislative body or a municipal body, but related to this issue. If we are wanting to stop the toxic waste in our communities, how much power does this person on city council have to stop the disposal of toxic waste in our communities? The other axis is the position or perspective on our agenda. So the way that you read this, and we have an example in a minute, is that on the very left where it says die hard, that is the person who is on our side. That doesn't mean that they're, I'll back up. When we talk about certain bills, it may be confusing if we're like repealing the ACA. We are against the repeal of the ACA, but the people who are supporting the ACA are die hard with us, that they want to support and protect healthcare reform. They want to make sure that people have access to healthcare. So die hard is with us. Die hard against are the people who oppose us and opponents. They go on the far right side. So when we use that, we can actually assess how much power and the level of support for an issue that someone has in our organizing efforts. When we've identified who needs to go on a power map, so if it's a municipal effort, we're talking about city councilors. If it's a school board measure, we're talking about school board members. If we're talking about state legislative policy, it's members of the state legislature. But we have to do some work. We have to figure out what do they care about? And do their issues, interests, and values align with ours? Who influences these decision makers? What are their positions on our issue? And what are the values or experiences they have that might influence their views? How do we find that out? Let's get hands up. Where might we find this information? I heard one hand over here say we could talk to them. Others, raise your hand. Have one down here too?
Yeah, actually, that gentleman hasn't voted.
You can look at past voting record.
Past voting record? Where would you find that?
Online or in the congressional record or in the records from whatever municipality you're working with.
Yeah, you can do an online search to see what their previous comments were. You could look on the website for their body and usually find a lot of information that's publicly available. Where else might you find this information? You can ask, you can do a Google search. One of our resident experts, Michelle, also has an opinion up here on the front row. 1 second, sorry.
One of the things our group does is download the FEC filings for the PAC contributions to understand where they're receiving their money.
Yeah, really smart, right? If we want to know who influences them and what they believe, we ask. And if we don't get straight answers or if we don't get the full picture, we can do some research. We can hold those meetings with our local elected officials, our state elected officials. We can go to their offices. These are public spaces. We can ask them about how they plan to vote. We can call them. We can send postcards. We can do all those things. We can look at their previous comments. We can look at who's giving to their campaigns and who may be exercising pressure for their re-election purposes. But what else should we do? Are there other things that we could do to figure out what influences these folks?
Social media, but the whole, I hesitated to say it because of the interpretations being possibly bogus.
Yeah, you could look at their social media accounts. Whether or not they're true and honest is a different question, but it can give you an indication of potentially where they may be. So what we're going to do now is actually talk about how our local folks, we're going to go through a model again, did some work to identify the targets in the ACA repeal and what their groups did in conjunction with others across the country to assess where they should spend their efforts to stop the repeal of the Affordable Care Act and protect the health care of millions of Americans. Okay, so let's bring the mics down for our two folks over here. And we're going to ask you to share some information with us about how you did your assessment and your power map. And I'm going to go over here and raise up our map. Okay, let's talk about it. So you said you went to your Massachusetts delegation and they are all in favor. Yay, the work is done. Healthcare is saved, right?
Not quite.
Okay, so what happened? What did you learn?
Well, so I think we decided pretty early on that this was not going to be uncommon. You know, we live in a state with a delegation that we happen to agree with a lot of the time. And so we wanted to develop Indivisible Somerville in particular, wanted to develop an ongoing relationship with other grassroots organizations in the areas that we actually wanted to influence. And that was sort of our you know, our main vector on that problem.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Michelle, what did you learn when you started looking at Congress specifically? Let's talk about the Senate. When you started thinking about this power map, the people who were supportive of healthcare and your position and were fighting against the repeal of the ACA, where were some of the actors along this map?
They were all the way in the supportive column.
Who's they?
Our delegates.
Okay.
So our two senators, both Markey and Warren, were firmly for or against the repeal of ACA.
Yeah, so the Massachusetts delegation was all the way over here, very supportive of your position, wanted to keep healthcare, had a lot of power because in the Senate there's only 100 folks, but at the same time, that wasn't enough, right? Yeah. Let's talk about other people who may have been in a similar position to the Massachusetts delegation. What other actors were here in the US Senate during the repeal?
All the way on.
All the way supportive and with some power.
With some power. So certainly the constituents that voted in our delegation, we exercise some power over them, but obviously much less than they have themselves. Within the Senate yourself, within the Senate itself, you're asking?
We'll add organized folks in a minute.
Okay.
So who else, members of the Senate, were over here deeply supportive and had some power?
Members of the Senate who were, well, there was the opposition had about the same amount of power, because once you firmly state your position, your power decreases in the Senate. Yeah. So there were those, in either case, their power was lower.
So I'm going to put some people
Senate
on
members
here.
You're talking about.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I'll say Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
He was over here, right?
Yeah, he could pull the bill.
He set the agenda.
Yeah.
He put the bill in motion,
Right.
had a lot of power, and was completely opposed to your point of view.
Right.
And wanted to overturn the Affordable Care Act and get rid of healthcare for millions. So lots of power and completely opposed. And let's add some meat here. There were, I think, 47.
Oh, how many? Oh, yeah, there were 47 other senators. Well,
Yeah, 47 Democrats.
45. We thought
45?
there were roughly 10, 5 in either direction.
Okay. So there were 45 Democrats here, roughly.
Yeah, Democrats were all pretty firmly against the repeal.
So you had 45 Democrats here. You said you had about 2 Democrats who were here.
Yeah, roughly. Yeah.
Maybe one. We can do this. We'll do 1D there and maybe 1D.
We got our math wrong, but yeah, that would make
And
it.
this was Manchin.
Whatever. Yeah. Manchin. Heidi.
From North Dakota?
Yeah. And then more importantly, there were the R's on the other side that we felt we could flip.
Yeah, so most of the Republican caucus was here.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of institutional power. They were lockstep with their leader. But then there were some interesting people here in the middle of the map. Who were they?
Susan Collins in Maine.
Yeah.
Key.
Who else?
Lisa Murkowski was a target. We thought we might be able to flip Rob Porter in Ohio. Portman, thank you, Portman.
Okay. Oregon, right?
And we had no idea, but John McCain apparently.
Yeah. Let's do McCain over here. Arizona. So, when you started to understand the dynamics, that you had almost all of the Democrats who were either leaning supportive or very supportive with very little power, and then you had the majority in the US Senate, at least from what we understood on the outset, very strongly opposed to your position with lots of power, these people became much more important to the campaign to protect healthcare reform. So what did your organization do? What did you guys do?
Well, at this point, we were into several rounds of the repeal of the ACA. So at this point, we were at the Senate bill, and Indivisible was a little bit more organized. So Indivisible National was able to set up something called the Hub Dialer. And what that enabled us to do was to contact people in those very swing states. And
So
yeah,
Maine,
so that would be in Maine and
Alaska,
Ohio and
or Oregon and Arizona.
yeah. And we could reach out to constituents there and say, hey, we know you're probably for the ACA or opposed to the AHCA. We know that because you're a registered Democrat. They went off the voting records. So what do you say if we patch you through to the Senate office and you can record your opposition to this bill to your state senator? And we had enormous success with that because a lot of people really did feel that way, but they had no idea how to actually make that phone call themselves. So we patched them through, their voices were recorded, and we felt that that was very influential in helping stop the bill go through.
Great. So you can see this kind of tool actually allows you to focus your resources and your strategy. So what these groups here in Massachusetts did, they realized that their camp was over here. Their delegation was here, needed no additional contacts. And in fact, I think, Sean, you said, you were taking time away from those staffers.
Right, yeah.
So where they focused their efforts instead, and where their strategy became really clear, they realized they had to pull these folks over and up. They had to take them off of their position on the map here and move them more supportive and increase their power if they wanted to kill the bill. So that's why you saw so many groups, and I put a picture of one of my friends, Dawn Russell, up here. She was one of the ADAPT protesters in Colorado who got arrested. All of the folks who started to focus their efforts in these key areas consolidated their efforts because they knew this was the strategic pathway to win. And what happened?
Well, they didn't pass it.
Woohoo! Yeah, this
Yeah.
is what happens when we organize well, right? Real people Making change. So we go through this assessment and use a power map to try and understand where folks are going to be. So ultimately, we can choose a strategy of saying, right, if we want to increase access to healthcare, we want to protect universal healthcare, we actually have to change the hearts and minds of these people to protect the system we have so we can build upon it. This is how we start to get to our strategy statement and ultimately the next session tomorrow. When we talk about the activity you just went through, I want to go through just a very quick example of what it would look like in the scenario you had. You can do this on your own. We have the materials for you to do it at the end as well. But we started to give you the names of certain counselors and their position. If you were to map out the counselors for one of those specific municipal policies in the scenario you were given, Counselor Grape would be here. We would have Counselor Still here, Counselor Ward with a lot of institutional power, but not necessarily committed to our issues. Counselor Stern very actively against with a good amount of power, and then Counselor Petty, so petty, with lots of institutional power and against our issue. But just having those actors, it doesn't tell the whole story. You actually have to start to see how folks are related and their connections, because if we were to take the vote today on one of the measures, one of the solutions that you were offering as groups, how would the vote go? Would the measure that you proposed, whether it was remediation or racial impact statements, or it was not in my backyard, would that policy pass today? Looking at this power map. I'm seeing some shaking heads. No. Why not? Let's get a mic.
Because the relationship, the strong relationships are all more or less to the right, and the diehard is isolated on the left with, it looks like, only one connection on the right.
Yeah.
And
So-
that imbalance means that if Petty is up there because he's the most powerful person.
Yeah. She's there because she has the most power,
yeah.
and she does have a lot of influence with other folks. So let's say you needed a majority. You needed 3 of the 5 counselors to vote for this measure. You said it would fail. What would the vote count be, though? What do you think it would be if Grape's proposal were to be introduced to this council? Would it be 2-3? Would it be 1-4? Would it be 5-0?
It'd depend on the work you did.
That's the right answer. That is totally the right answer, right? But today, if the vote were held, the policy that you proposed probably wouldn't pass. But that's why we use a power map. It actually assesses power relationships in real time and informs your strategy. So you got to the punchline, right? This is not meant to be static. It is meant to be dynamic. You can use this information then to say, if I see there's a lot of relationship and a lot of influence over here, what can I do to change the dynamic so these people feel accountable to the policy position we're pushing and they take the right vote? So instead of having a 1-4 vote where Grape is the only one voting yay and all 4 other counselors are voting nay, what could we do? We also talked about other people, organized groups, right? People like us in this room who can influence these city councilors, these state legislators, these members of Congress, even members of the US Senate. You just heard real people in your communities who did this amazing work, right, to change the dynamic of a power map. We put ourselves here, we add value, and we change the outcome. This is how we win. This is how we build power, and it's using simple tools like this on a blackboard or in your notebook where you can actually map out how power works and you can change the world. For me, folks, I want to say it's been an honor to spend the evening with you talking about these simple tools. There are a few materials that you can access online at resistanceschool.com, and we're going to talk about some specific next steps as we close out for the evening. So thank you so much for the time. I hope you learned something.
Great. Please join me in giving Jesse another round of applause for this powerful training. And thank you to all of you here today who joined us tonight to learn about the theory of change. We hope what you learned tonight fuels you to reclaim, rebuild, and reimagine our communities. Like Jesse mentioned, we do have a worksheet available on our website, resistanceschool.com that you can use to practice and structure your theory of change. You can also find a recording of this session and our first and second sessions on the same website. And here's a few more ways you can stay engaged with Resistance School. Our partner, Resistance School at Berkeley, is back next week, Thursday, November 16th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, with Ian Haney Lopez speaking on communicating about race in politics and organizing. And we will be back for our last session of this semester on November 21st. Like us on Facebook to be the first to know about session 4 and our speaker. We promise you don't want to miss this last session. Find us at facebook.com/resistanceschool. And tell us what you think by following the link at the end of this session. We want to know what we can do better to make sure you're equipped to make change in your communities. Finally, make sure to spread the word. Please share our videos, invite your friends and family to join us next time. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.